Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Simon and Jordan here once again. We interrupt the debate for a little wine because this is probably a little more entertaining and probably a little more informative than debate. We're being well, but say la vie with politics. Today we're excited because we actually have our first live guest of the series, which is super awesome. We have Sam Berketa, the winemaker from AlphaBox and Dice.
Hey everybody. Yeah.
I teased this up, Sam, by saying that I think AlphaBox is probably one of the most ambitious projects right now in all of wine across the world, really. I don't know if anyone's doing what you guys are trying to do. Why don't we start with a little bit of background on yourself and how you came to be with AlphaBox, and a little bit about the winery as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. It's great to be able to contact you guys in what's a crazy time at the moment. So I guess I got into winemaking back in 2010. I started just by going to uni. We've got a really good course here in Adelaide that is a double degree for viticulture and oenology, or winemaking and viti. And so I started there, transferring across from a chemistry degree. So I was doing molecule and drug design, and then natural progression, move into winemaking, right? From drugs into and so I started. I wasn't really enjoying where I was at with the chemistry degree. I was working in a lab at the time and wanted to be more involved with the outdoors rather than just seeing it through the outside window. And I actually wanted to drop out and do visual arts and become an artist. But with sort of a guiding hand from my parents, was sort of like, maybe do art as a hobby and chase something else that still might draw in a bit more of an income, which is how I sort of ended up as the marriage of art and science in the middle of with winemaking. And since I've started, I haven't looked back. It's been a pretty incredible journey. I've worked in McLaren Vale at a few different wineries down here. I've worked in Germany, in the Rheinhessen, making Rieslings and Silvaner and Müller-Thurgau and all those fun, hard to pronounce varieties over there. I've done vintages also here in Australia in the Yarra Valley, and then I worked for 18 months in vineyards, being assistant vineyard manager at a little winery called Quealy, down the Mornington Peninsula. And they had some really fun things. So they dealt with things like Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, but also like Friulano, Malvasia, things that like really aren't planted anywhere else, and even in Australia. So it's really cool to get to know those varieties, and also things like Pinot and Chardonnay that usually come out of the area. Moved back to Australia, moved back to Adelaide to join AlphaBox and Dice. And since I've been here, I've also worked overseas in Barolo, which was pretty incredible. And then I've also done a few vintages in California, but down south in Monterey County, as opposed to up in Napa. So, I've been here at AlphaBox and Dice for about 5 years now. Took over winemaking from the original owner and head winemaker at the time. I got brought in to be assistant winemaker, but 2 weeks of me being there, and the old winemaker was, you'll be operational winemaker and I'll be here 2 days a week. And then after about a month, he was gone completely and sort of out of the frying pan into the fire, and took on the lead role. So it's been a bit of a baptism of fire and learning how to do things from the ground up. And it's been a really exciting journey, and we've been making some really cool wines. So a bit about Alpha, I guess. I should probably lead into a bit about that. Enough about me. So we're pretty ambitious, as Simon said. We're looking at trying to do one wine for each letter of the alphabet. So we've got, we haven't quite completed the alphabet yet. We're about 21 letters down, missing a few bits and pieces, but I can I wonder if I can go for a walk and see if I can show you. This is our cellar door down here in McLaren Vale at the moment, but we've got, you can see, how am I going to do this? There, at the top there, they're all of our labels that we've been doing so far. So we're missing a few letters. I don't know if I can zoom in, but we've So every letter basically is a different style of winemaking. Most wineries down here in McLaren Vale just play around with Shiraz, Cab, Grenache, a little bit of warm climate Chardonnay, and that's generally what the region's been producing for the last 20 years. But we like to deal with everything that's not that. So we do red, white, sparkling, bubbles, same thing, pink. We do using French varieties, Italian, Spanish, German, Austrian, Portuguese. We do blends, multi-vintage, non-vintage, single varietal. We do the whole box and dice, which is basically an old saying, Aussie saying that means the whole collection. And hence why we're trying to use all these international styles, but from South Australian vineyards. So really trying to gain the whole collection of winemaking from, using these awesome varieties that are grown down here in South Australia, in our lovely state. Yeah, here.
I gotta ask, where did the concept come from, like to do 26 labels of primarily, European and especially not even like international varietals like Cabernet Sauvignon Merlot, but like really strongly European and particularly Italian varietals? Where's the genesis for all that?
Yeah, so it comes from a few places, especially the alphabet way of classifying things. So rather than calling, I guess, our wines by a vineyard name or looking at sort of site-specific areas, we sort of wanted to use it as an opportunity to educate people on what else is out there. So at that time, we were primarily a culture that drank Shiraz and Cabernet and Sauvignon Blanc from the Adelaide Hills for whites. And so it takes a bit, and we're still finding it now that it's taking a bit of time to re-educate people and educate people on what else is out there. Because it's hard to sort of explain just how much of a strong Shiraz and Cabernet culture we have here in South Australia, because we have regions like the Barossa and McLaren Vale and Coonawarra that have been producing these big heavy reds for such a long time now, and they've been doing so well on the international stage as well as the domestic stage. So they've sort of been dominating that market. So we really want to put ourselves outside of the box and try a lot of different things. And the other thing that sort of ties in with this is that South Australia it's a really warm, hot, dry place. I think we had an ad campaign that was like, it's one of the driest states and one of the driest countries on earth. And so to use water-hungry varieties like Shiraz and Cabernet that don't deal well in warm climates it's sort of backwards thinking. So what we really are trying to do is trying to also educate not only consumers, but also growers and other winemakers, and just try and use these varieties and make them in a really approachable style that still makes some really, really interesting wines that are better suited to our climates and will be a better choice for future viticulture. Because with things like climate change, we're seeing some really, really drastic changes in the weather patterns over the years. And so it's sort of just being a really good opportunity to make these wines. And I guess the third point is that we just love these styles of wine. So it's great to be able to play around them and make these styles how we want to.
Just to touch on that really quickly, because I mean, we could go in, this is a rabbit hole we could go on for hours. You touched on climate change in a sense, and obviously with the fires that happened in Australia early part of the year, where is Australia sitting at? I mean, especially we've seen in the last few weeks, months, that with the fires in California and other hot regions like the Barossa and in the southern Australia, I'm trying to think of the way I can word this question, but it's not how serious it is, but rather, how does the industry sort of adapt and react to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure, as you said, you would have seen that half of Australia was on fire this year. I think the only place that escaped unscathed was WA, Western Australia. So down here, we had the Hills fires, which wiped out half the Adelaide Hills. We had a fire in Kangaroo Island, which had smoke taint coming across over to McLaren Vale, where we are, and affecting the lower parts of the hills. So pretty much all of South Australia got affected by smoke taint last year. And if it wasn't that, it was early frost as well down in the southeast where Coonawarra is. So we're seeing these, as I said, abnormal weather patterns more frequently. I think almost every year that I've been at Alpha, we've had a fire somewhere in South Australia. It's affected some region. The vineyard where we get some of the Nebbiolo from in 2015, the fruit was smoke tainted, and so we didn't make any in 2015. There's little things like that where it's just been around, and obviously this year was the boiling point where everything sort of went up, and we're really seeing that become a huge problem. And so it makes sense to plant varieties that can adapt to that weather, but how we tackle that in the future, I think there's going to be a lot more infrastructure put into place to manage how we deal with the fires and those sort of things as it evolves.
Right.
Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it kind of does, because like that's the thing. I guess I asked this about 2 months ago. We had an interview with someone from Napa, and I guess much the same, because the fires, not so much because at that time the fires hadn't happened yet in Napa, but sort of the same idea where it's certainly you're in a position where with global warming and climate change and things like that, it's hard to prepare and try to do the right to do by try to make a living without trying to worried about your vineyards burning down every year, or not the vineyards per se, but the infrastructure more to the point. And this is in California more around than the actual wineries itself. But yeah, it's not something that how can we say? It's something that I guess you'd have to. It's almost like you need a contingency plan for on a year-to-year basis now. Like, just what's the game plan going into? Should we have a fire this year? It's like, okay, well, this got to happen, but I guess you can't really plan for that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're probably luckier than most wineries, considering we don't own any vineyards. So we're pretty flexible in terms of being able to avoid that. Obviously, what comes with that is that we do honor our contracts, and we have long-standing growers that we've worked with for over 10 years. And the biggest part of my role is not so much winemaking, but it's grower relations, and keeping in touch with those growers. So we love to support our growers as much as possible. And so like this year, one of our vineyards that supplies us with Nebbiolo, Chardonnay, Tempranillo, Barbera, and a bit of Gruner out there as well. They had the fire go through the whole vineyard, and it's tragic for him. He's still really recovering now, and we're sort of trying to work with ways for him to help sort of rejuvenate the vineyard, but also try and forecast against further protections of it. And I guess there's things like sprinkler systems and I guess keeping down of matter, because one of the big viticultural things that has been happening recently is throwing mulch under vine, but obviously with the mulch under vine there, that just forms a lot of dry tinder for the fires to go through, and then it just melts everything and really burns the roots and the trunk system. So effectively terminating any hope you had of keeping the vine alive. So there's little things like that I think is going to change the way that people manage their vineyards as well. Right. But yeah, ultimately it's just terrifying knowing that at any year everything could go up in smoke. But we do it because we love it, and we have to keep on keeping on, I think.
Well, I know that you guys are certainly. I mean, you guys were introduced to me as the crazy guys that are trying everything. But just to backtrack, I had dinner with Miguel Torres a couple of years ago, and he was introducing the indigenous Spanish varieties that his company was going to move towards and away from things like Grenache and Tempranillo and whatnot, because he felt that climate change, he wanted stuff that ripened later, so that his phenolic and sugar ripening was happening at the same time. I know that the kind of the mission of your place is to have, like you said, the whole alphabet. But have you found any of those grapes where you think, what, this actually might be the future? Like, this might be the way forward away from Shiraz and Cabernet?
Definitely. McLaren Vale, being so close to the ocean, having a hot Mediterranean climate, it just makes sense to have Sicilian varieties planted here. And Nero d'Avola is probably the most unique variety that we have. That looks so different to anything from Sicily. It already has its own unique flavors and unique palate to it when coming from McLaren Vale. And it just it can throw a crop for those people that want to grow, 15 tons to the acre of wine, and just make some bulk stuff. But it also, if you put in the effort, it can make some absolutely beautiful wines down here. And so it sort of caters to all markets, requires less water, it's more drought tolerant, doesn't hate the sunshine. It's just, it is one of those varieties that has just worked really well down here. You said Grenache before. That's one of the major, that's like a gateway variety to a lot of the growers down here. So they're finding that moving away from Shiraz, a baby step is to go to Grenache because they're more familiar with it. They've seen it here. They know it does well. And McLaren Vale Grenache pricing has gone through the roof down here. So that's definitely also one of those varieties. In the hills, things like Nebbiolo, as well as we're seeing, like people have always been worried about getting it ripe in the Adelaide Hills, even though it's a lot warmer than it is in Italy.
For sure.
Yeah, and so they haven't really planted it, but with all the warm weather we've been having and all the warm years, we're having no trouble getting it right. If anything, it's about sort of making sure we don't pick it too overripe. And so that's also probably providing a better option. And the hills has always been Pinot country and Chardonnay country, but it's even probably getting a bit warm for those varieties now. And so they're looking at things like Shiraz, moving Shiraz vineyards up there and Cabernet vineyards up to the Adelaide Hills as more of their sort of premium areas as well. So there's a lot of flux going on at the moment.
Sure.
And as people are just trying to predict the trends for the future. Sorry.
Well, just to this wine that we have, which is the Nebbiolo.
Yep.
I've seen it a couple times planted in California as mostly a disaster. Well, not disaster. It's fat. It's one dimensional. And I always kind of thought of it as a grape that is absolutely just indigenous to where it's from. If you take it out of the fog, I don't think McLaren Vale is known for its fog, is it?
No, not at all. And so as I said, this stuff comes from the Adelaide Hills.
Adelaide Hills,
and it's not really. There's the southern, so we get it from Adelaide Hills. So there's a southern part that has like a lot of autumnal fog, especially as we're getting in towards winter. And so being close, it's probably 10 kilometers from the ocean. So you can see the ocean from the vineyard basically, but it's at a nice high altitude that it sort of allows it to be a lot cooler, to get plenty of sunshine in there, to get the tannins right. But it does have that sort of those cool and misty mornings, but even so, we're still picking it when there's a lot of leaf deterioration, the leaves will start dropping off down there. And that means that we've got plenty of great acid retention in there, even as we're getting lots of those developed flavors, and the tannins are getting a lot riper. The other vineyard is at the northern end of the Adelaide Hills, so basically almost towards the border of the Barossa. So the Adelaide Hills, I don't know if many people know this, but the Adelaide Hills sort of runs along the backbones, it forms the backbone of McLaren Vale, past Adelaide City and the township, and then runs up all the way into the Barossa. And so it really is sort of the backbone wine region. You can travel all the way between the regions, via the Adelaide Hills. And so it's quite a long, skinny, but diverse region. So there's lots of little microclimates. And up the northern end, where it's a lot drier, but a lot higher altitude, you still get those cool nights, but warmer days that again help you keep acid and allow the wine to ripen a lot slower and get that formation of flavors and desired characteristics from it. The one thing we probably don't get a lot of is tannin. So it's certainly not the most tannic Nebbiolo we've ever seen. So, I treat this with a lot of patience. It's a wine that takes 3 years in barrel, 6 weeks total skin contact. And so it's one of those wines that just requires a bit of patience. But it probably exhibits more of like a Valtellina style Nebbiolo, where it's a little bit younger, more acid based, but less sort of big and bold and grippy on the palate. I think that's sort of the style was into more Barolo, but it's turned out more like Valtellina, I guess.
I was gonna say, because spending 18 months, you said, working in Barolo, that's kind of taught you a lot dealing with Nebbiolo, even in Australia. What other than the tannin, what some other key differences you'd notice within the two wines, Barolo versus Adelaide Hills Nebbiolo?
Yeah, one of the other things as well is definitely color. Like, I know Nebbiolo is not a very colored variety in the first place, but it still doesn't have the quite deeper hue as a lot of the Barolos have had, especially the few recent years of Barolo. Yeah, and I just find the Adelaide Hills can be a little bit more aggressive up front, so a little bit more fuller up front rather, and doesn't require anywhere near as much time to soften. Not just from the tannin perspective, but from the flavor point of view as well. Like we see a lot of the early onset of more of those secondary characteristics coming through, even after sort of 2 years of age, as opposed to Barolo or the Piedmontese stuff that takes a bit longer to soften out flavor-wise as well.
Did you say that there was skin contact for 6 weeks? That means that the fermentation is a 6 week long ferment at a cold temperature?
Yeah, that's it.
It's funny. We're actually talking to Elio Altare on Friday. And
great.
One of the questions we're going to ask them is their side of the traditional versus modern. And we'll have to tell her that you do a 6 week long ferment. It's
funny you say that. So this is our take. This is my sort of modernist take of Nebbiolo. So it gets a little bit of new oak. It's like 5%, I think. So that's something quite small, and that's just to really bolster the tannins and support it with some spicier characteristics in there. But from 2016 vintage as well, I had about 800 kilos that I put into a little stainless steel vat and left it on skins for 406 days. Yeah, 406. So over a year.
and is that blended in?
It has a little bit of that in here. It's got a single barrel of it. So all I got out of it was a puncheon, so 500 liters and a 225 barrique. So the barrique went into this blend, and that really bolsters up that sort of anisey, spicy, clovey characteristics to it, and really did a lot for the tannic weight to it as well. But that other style is more of our traditionalist wine. Actually, I'll go grab the label for it.
Sure. Well, while Sam's away, has everyone had a chance to try this? Like, what do we think? Because we were talking about how this is so expressive for.
Yeah, it's got savory notes that I actually I don't live my life like this, but I had 2 Barolos at lunch, and
that's a great day.
I'm off this week, but certainly both of those, and they were older Barolos, still were not as savory as this. It's like we were joking before that it's like a spice rack fell off the wall and everything got put together. So there's like cardamom, and I got rosemary, and there's definitely like a saline. There's a smoky note, which is now I can't get. Yeah, this is most definitely different and most definitely spicier than just about any other Nebbiolo I've ever had.
Oh, fantastic. I guess, yeah. I mean, I'm wondering if that's either the clones we've got. So there's one of the vineyards has a lot of different clones. It's one of the oldest vineyards in the Adelaide Hills, but it still puts it at about 20, 25 years old. It's got a mix of about 5 clones through it. From sort of like one that's more of a rosé clone that's sort of lower quality and gives you more of that sort of strawberries and cream characteristics to it, to what we call a 230 clone, which is a lot more robust and a lot more sort of that classic Nebbiolo characteristics to it. And we've got another it's called the Lampia Lamora biotype clone, which is the other vineyard in the southern end of the Adelaide Hills that gives you more of that anisey, cardamom-y, real sort of like chocolate, cacao nibs, that sort of characteristics to it. And so the vineyards, I guess just really are expressive of that spice and spicier quality to it. Again, leaving it in pretty much all old oak for a long period of time. So with this one, actually, it was barrique for a year, and then into botti for a year. So I've got a 2,500 litre cask that we put it into, and then back to barrique for another year as well, to help it sort of soften out. And I learned that from when I was in Barolo, visiting places like Chiretto and a lot of the places down there. That's sort of the way they do it. So it's
do that kind of ping pong, like small, big, small.
Yeah, exactly. And all of our stuff's on stillage, so we don't use cradles. Like when it goes in the barrel, it sits there and goes there until it needs to be moved. So it's a bit of a logistical nightmare in the cellar. So yeah, with having barrels sort of stacked up in a pyramid style, you can't really get to the ones on the bottom without moving everything on top, which is kind of annoying, but also really good for letting the wines just sit and you don't tamper with them, you don't touch them, you don't wake them up, you just let them sit in there, and just relax over that time. As I said, patience is a winemaker's biggest tool. So yeah, we hardly rack these. It goes only for those sort of movements. Do we move it?
You must have quite the labeling system, because I mean, you ever like accidentally like you're blending everything? Oh fuck, that was Chardonnay, you know? Like.
Yeah, I mean, it's all pretty much most of it's. I write on the barrels, but pretty much most of it's up in my head, up here. So
yeah, wow.
Yeah, and everything's just written on chalk. So, but you try and have every set of stillage the same. But we do, as I said, we do 26 different letters of 40 different varieties, 40 different vineyards. We took 29 different varieties last year, and so it's sometimes it's not as clean as you would like the cellar to be. This rack is completely Shiraz, or this rack is completely Chardonnay, or that sort of thing. So it does get a bit tricky, but you just have to sort of taste through every barrel and make sure you're on the right track when you're doing it. Yeah.
I have nothing but respect for winemakers such as yourself and wineries like this, because domestically in British Columbia, we have a winery that I'm quite fond of called Mooncursor, and Mooncursor just sits right at the border of Canada and the United States. And they're a little bit like yourself in a sense that they generally grow a lot of odd varietals that have no business growing in Canada, but they do it anyway, right? They grow things like Triga Nacional, which actually won the Lieutenant Governor Award this year for his best Canadian wine. They do Dolcetto, they do, what are they? Arnace, they do
Tempranillo.
Tempranillo. And like, this is a region like the Okanagan, I don't know if you've ever had the chance to be, but our big wines for the south part of the Okanagan, where the hot part of our valley is maybe Cab Franc, Syrah in a good year, a little bit of Cab. Generally it can be a little green.
Merlot's good.
Merlot's good. Yeah, Merlot's okay in the right year. But I salute the trailblazer, I guess, in a sense that, it's sort of easy for you as a winery and to the owner of a winery to be like, okay, well, we're in a great position to grow more Shiraz, grow more Cabernet, grow more Chardonnay, and just kind of put our name on the pile with everybody else. Like, here's one of many kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you were saying even off before we started that there's other wineries that are doing Nebbiolo and Sangiovese, I believe, around you. I'm wondering what's the proliferation of wineries starting to experiment with Italian varietals in South Australia?
Yeah, so pretty much, I'd like to say that we, 13 years ago when AlphaBox and I started, we sort of set the trend for it, but pretty much almost every winery now will be doing something alternative or something emerging, as we call it. There's all these different names for these different varieties. It's one of the great things about Australia. I don't know if we touched on this, but it's like it's like Canada, where we don't have all the AOC rules and all the regulations and stuff, but we can plant whatever we want, wherever we want. We've got a vineyard where we've got Gruner on half the row, and then it's Nebbiolo on the top end of it. So it's like where it's higher up, and so we can literally do whatever we want, and it's really fun to do that. So people are really quite often experimenting with lots of different things, but and as these varieties are gaining more popularity, and we're seeing the drinking culture change from with the younger generation coming through, they're not interested in just Shiraz and Pinot anymore. They're looking, and Cabernet and stuff. So they're looking at these alternative varieties as more interesting things to drink. And obviously you've probably seen that the rise of natural wine is pretty big down here, especially in the Adelaide Hills region. And so that's another thing that's sort of triggering this change. And so people, the generation these days just are looking for the next new thing, the next, what's really interesting. How can I further my knowledge and my education? And let's try these new things. And and it's sort of becoming a bit more of a trend and a movement. And so people, I think, everyone's sort of cottoned onto this now. Even some of the older, dare I say, dinosaurs of the wine regions down here are looking at these varieties and experimenting and finding different things. So it'd be hard pressed to find a winery down here that hasn't been experimenting with alternative varieties, even if it's things closer to home like Touriga or Tempranillo, or weirder things like what else we got plant down here? There's Nero de Troya and Alianico and that sort of stuff that's being grown down here now, which is paving the way for really interesting times ahead. But it's still majority is still planted to Shiraz and Cab at the moment.
Where, and this kind of leads to a really great question. Where is the Australian wine market as you see it? I often say for me, what I do, I feel like Australian wine right now is sort of this three-pronged sort of, fork in the road, in the sense that you've got one Australia that still is very much bulk and value driven, and the big brands that we move pallets upon pallets upon pallets of for really cheap, and it's very quite extracted, and it's very crowd pleasing, and you can get it for $8-9 a bottle. You've got the traditional Australia, that the bigger names that really have kind of paved the way, the Henschke's and the Penfolds and the Olumbas of the world. But we're not, I know in our market particularly, those a lot of those brands aren't as popular as they probably once were.
Okay.
For whatever reason, whether it be, in case of something like a Penfolds, where their prices have, I think, gone up quite drastically over the past, say, 3 or 4 years. And then you've got the third Australia, which is sort of like more what you guys are doing. It's a little bit more experimental, trying new things, trying to carve out a new identity, I guess, in a sense. So yeah, just some thoughts on the Australian wine scene as it relates both domestically within Australia and internationally, and how that all kind of fits together.
Yeah, well, so we did a very interesting thing this year. Attached to our warehouse, we decided that in the middle of COVID, wouldn't it be a great idea to open up a wine shop? So we added we've got our own sort of online only wine store, just because we weren't doing enough to try and keep our business afloat. No, so we added in all these wines, and that's been really good to see what drinking trends and what's really getting popular, what's really popular at the moment, and people are drinking. So we haven't pigeonholed the shop into being just sort of just natural wines, or just South Australian wines, or or just traditional styles. We have the whole gamut. We have international versus domestic versus cult and progressive to natural to we've got all the different styles there. And so it's interesting seeing that the orange wine movement, especially sort of at that entry level price point, that sort of $10 to $20 is really, really, really popular with consumers at the moment. And again, I don't know if that's a skew on the people who are shopping on our website and all that sort of stuff. But then, we're also seeing there's quite a big trend for the traditionals. So, we had a Hill of Grace on there, and that's sold. We have all the, I don't know if you've heard of Wendouree, but we had Wendouree on there, and that's sold out. And things like Voyager Estate and some of the classics around here are really, really popular, and people are really buying them. So it's still quite a diverse scene. I think you definitely have to be everything pretty much has to be vegan these days. If you're not vegan, then it's harder to get on wine lists and harder to sell to people. It's just been this massive movement where people, regardless of whether you drink natural wines a lot or that progressive style, it's sort of filtered back into the rest of the wine industry, and people just want more sustainable focused wines in general. So whether it is just vegan wines, or whether they're looking for organics, there's certainly a big shift in people's drinking habits here towards more natural and organic and sustainable is the word I guess we're looking for. Sustainable drinking. So that's probably the biggest shift at the moment I've seen. But we're still definitely seeing more of those traditional wines, or some of those traditional wines being drunk. Yeah.
I was waiting for that question. If you could explain what vegan means, because people didn't know that that vegan applied to grapes.
Yeah, so it's funny, and we can open a huge kettle of fish here. So basically, so for me, we classify ourselves as minimal intervention, which means I don't add anything to a wine that doesn't need to be there. So I don't think that wine needs to have any animal products in there. So in terms of animal products, it's all about finding agents. You can handpick grapes, you can get them into the winery, but so you can add things like egg whites. and that helps to get rid of some of the protein instabilities in wine, which causes a haze. But you can get rid of that by just aging it in barrel for a bit of time. You can add gelatin, which is again another settling agent or flotation agent, which helps to clarify the wine. But you know, there's plenty of vegetable options if you wanted to go down that route. There's things like Eisenglass, which is isolated from fish swim bladders, particularly those of sturgeon fish. And that's, again, another way to get rid of bitterness and astringency and pinking in wine. And so there's all these sort of animal products that you can add to a wine, but there's also, I mean, as I said, we don't use any of these other products, but there are things like you can chuck plastic in a wine that has the same effect as Eisenglass. You can add in bentonite, which does the same thing as albumin, and those sort of things. Bentonite being a clay-based product that just naturally grabs all the proteins as it settles out the bottom of the tank. So there are other options that I think these wineries, the bigger wineries that do these sort of fining trials, are really experimenting with. But yeah, for us, I mean, it's almost like it doesn't really matter, because we just everything goes, we try and handpick as much as we can. It goes into the winery, and then we basically don't add anything else to it. Sometimes, because of our warm climate, we will adjust the acidity a little bit, the freshness, but I tend to pick on acidity rather than sugar sweetness. So it's a balance between acidity and flavor ripeness. So as long as we've got plenty of flavor in there, and the acid's really high, that's when I'll pick it. And I'll pick it more based on sugar ripeness acid ripeness and sugar ripeness, which means we don't really usually have to adjust that much. And then it goes in a barrel, and barrels are wonderful things for wine. The shape of them helps to aid in settling. And so you get all this beautiful settling to the bottom of the barrel. It helps to cold stabilize it. It helps to heat stabilize it. And by the end of the 18 months that we've kept most of our wines in barrel for, they're heat stable, they're cold stable, and they're pretty bright and sparkly clean. So that was a long chat.
It's interesting. It's really interesting to me to hear all this, because it's sort of something that I would think. Do you do a lot of contemporaries around where your wineries, where your vineyards are they also picking on acid ripeness versus sugar ripeness? Because that's something I noticed. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the alcohol in this was pretty low. It's 12.5%.
Yeah, I think 14.
14? My bad. I looked at something earlier today, so it was marked it quite low. But but is that, I guess when in such a warm region, I guess that's sort of necessary to be picking, because you wait for sweet and sugar ripeness, you can be getting ones that are incredibly boozy.
Yeah, and that's been the hallmark of McLaren Vale and Barossa, is to make 16, 17% D's that, while they age well and get 100 Parker points, they're not what people are drinking anymore. I think, speaking of drinking trends, that's what people are sort of shifting away from, that classic, really extracted, really heavy in alcohol wines. People just don't really want that anymore. People want things that are a little bit cleaner, more fruit driven, more, less extracted, less hard wines to drink. And no one's cellaring stuff anymore either. Like I think 98% of the wines bought in Australia are drunk in the first 48 hours or some silly statistic like that.
Very similar in North America too. And I would agree. Like, I think, at least for myself, I as soon as I tell people that, by the way, buy this, set it down for 10 years, I lose a lot of people. I lose a lot of eyeballs, because it's sort of like, You told me to wait a year, maybe 2. Okay, I get that. You asked me to wait like 10, and I think that's part. I think there's a lot of reasons why. I think part of it's, most people that live in major urban hubs, they don't have the space. Like, you don't have a full basement or a room, and you're lucky if you do. If you can afford a proper cellar and things like that in their house, that's great. I think the other thing is too, the price of wine over even the last, say, 10 or 15 years has kind of done one of these here, where it's like, it used to be, okay, well, buy a case of Barolo for, $400 and, set it down for 15 years, no problem, but now to buy a case of, cellar worthy Barolo is going to set you back at least 600, if not more, like closer to 1,000 after taxes. Like, it's not a cheap endeavor anymore. So I see more and more, like, especially the classic producers that sort of release library releases, those sort of things where it's like, okay, well, we know it's going to be a great year, but not ready yet. But here, we'll also sell you, along with the 2016 Barolo, we'll offer you some 2007, and then it's like, okay, now we're talking. Okay, now we'll take that to the consumer, do that, and away we go, sell that, and then sell them the 15 to put down for the rainy day some years down the road.
Yeah. It's one of those things that, it's interesting here. So we do a lot of élevage in our wines. So as I said, 18 months is sort of the standard for keeping things in barrel. And that's a personal choice. That's when I think wines look their best. A lot of these varieties as well. And again, we do sort of take a lot of inspiration from Italy and France in terms of aging potentials as well. But the majority of wines here are bottled made in autumn, bottled in spring, and out to market by Christmas. And that's just the general way that people are making and producing and selling wines at the moment, especially from the more progressive producers. So, and people just seem to be lapping it up. They really enjoy the juicier, fruit forward, easy drinking wines that, just have no real cellaring potential, which is, I guess, one of the things that ties in with the natural wine thing, to be drunk and consumed within a year, being made. It's an interesting landscape at the moment.
Indeed. I was going to ask, what words would you say, like, if you were me and I had, say, like, I had someone come into my shop and say, okay, I'm looking for some Nebbiolo, and I say, okay, well, try this. They're like, whoa, no, like, no. And I mean, it's not just indicative of AlphaBox. I mean, I think there's a lot. We did a session a few months back of the kind of on this concept as well, sort of like the rebels that plant the things in odd places, and it's sort of, it's funny because in the one way, the wine world really does love continuity, right? We want to see, in some, I think in some corners of the wine world, Grange is still going to be one of the great wines of the world, and and that'll be that, and that's what that's what we want to see come out of Australia, and that's the Shiraz and the Cabernets. But as soon as they, okay, we'll try Nebbiolo or try Sangiovese or try Aglianico from Barossa or McLaren Vale or Adelaide, and they're like, I don't know, I think I'm going to go Nebbiolo, I think I'll buy Barolo. But I often tell people, like, you can't paint it in a corner of what it is, right? Like, I'll try to go off on a tangent a bit. I currently sell a Tempranillo grown in Napa Valley, and it's not something, without me hand selling it, it's not going to sell. And I always tell people, I always have to temper people. It's like, if you're expecting Rioja, even like a Crianza Rioja, this is not it. This is not it at all. But you have to love it for what it is. And I'm wondering if you've got some tips or something where you could say, okay, well, you know what? Give Nebbiolo from South Australia a chance. Give Aglianico a chance. So, yeah, I'm going to speak to that.
It's all context. People like, they don't want, like, La Vie en Rose sung by Billy Idol. It's like, there's just, no, I don't see that happening. But once you get them on it, it's it's different. And I think Australia, more than a lot of places, is not content to stay in their lane. Definitely, I think that rule breaking seems to be kind of woven in to the wine culture. I mean, certainly there's a lot of Shiraz, there's a lot of Cab, and I think a lot of the Shirazes and Cabs are fantastic, especially the Cabs. I'm getting really back into McLaren Vale Cab, actually. I think that Australia, certainly more than a lot of New World countries, Argentina is not really branching out that much from, Malbec, Bonarda, Cab, Chardonnay, and certainly Napa, like Simon was saying. I remember this one time Viader made a Cab Franc. I mean, that's almost the same word as Cab Sauv, and no one bought it. Except for this one guy who bought everything because he'd had it. He tried it, like, I guess, accidentally. But, yeah, consumers can be kind of picky. Like, no, we don't want you to do that. We don't want Billy Idol to sing the French song, So I think, is it also a case that Australian market is, it's more into diversity and not so dogmatic about this has to come from there?
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely a big part of it. I mean, a lot of what for us helps to sell our wines, and not just our labels, which every label is different, but it's the story behind it. So if you can give people a story and a reason why they should try this really interesting thing, even if it's just because it is different, you should try this because it's not your normal, it's not a Barolo Nebbiolo. It is something that showcases, as you said, like a bucket load of spice, as opposed to some of the Barolo Nebbiolos. And it's about, I guess, trying to get someone's interest and to try something different in this world. Now, as I was saying before, I think that's what a lot of the wine culture here has been seeing, is that we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of that idea that what is new is fun and interesting, and people are sort of open to experiencing this sort of stuff. Which, again, as you mentioned, the wine industry has sort of been stoic and steeped in tradition, and the more you can sort of rest on your family laurels of 6th generation winemakers, farming the same patch of land, it usually that tends to sell better. But I've been speaking to even on that front, like viticulturalists that do stints over in places like Spain or Italy, and they're like, why are you doing like this? And their answer was just how my grandparents did it, and their grandparents before them, and so that style hasn't changed. Whereas here, as you said, we're rule breaking, we're constantly trying to find better ways of doing things and keeping up with it, because we're not bound by these laws and traditions. And it's a bit of that sort of ties into, I think, the stories of how we make our wines and how we play around with our wines, and how we sell them too. So we use our labels to get people in and to get that first bottle off the shelf, but we really hope it's what's inside that gets people going back for that second bottle, and third bottle and fourth bottle, or we'll try the rest of the range and see what we've got, because it's a really interesting example, and doesn't quite look like anything from anywhere else in the world, and it is unique in that sense. So I guess it's about finding that adventurous drinker.
I think in some ways you've got it a little bit easier too, in a sense that if you're convince someone to take a risk and it's like, we're going to try Nebbiolo, Australian Nebbiolo, I almost think it's almost like enough of a risk that's like, okay, well, that's a completely subcategory versus perhaps the producer in Barossa that's making Shiraz, but making Shiraz kind of in like an Hermitage style. And you're like, ooh, that's I'm expecting Molly Duker or something like that, and I'm getting Chave. Like, this is weird, So I almost like, I was thinking, if you get convinced people take that much risk, it's almost like, okay, well, no expectations, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And that, as you said, that really helps us as well. It's been interesting. Canada's been one of the biggest supporters of our wines, especially the alternative varieties. They really, really are into things like Dolcetto and the Nebbiolo and Aglianico. They're sort of our top selling wines. And Canada is definitely leading that, I guess, that trend for us, and what we're seeing in the rest of the world. So thank you guys.
We're trying.
And I wonder if that's, obviously the Okanagan and Niagara areas are great areas to grow grapes, but I wonder if it's, it's not like, Napa is to America, or I guess, all the regions of France, where it is that idea that because you don't have such a strong wine region, maybe that's something that plays into it, and you guys are more open-minded about trying new things. And I shouldn't say it's not as established. It's just still fleggling wine industry.
It's young. It's a young place. Okanagan, especially. Niagara's been doing it for longer, but the Okanagan has really had only like vinifera for not very long. We had hybrids right up until pretty much the end of the 80s. It was predominantly like Maréchal Foch and whatnot. So I think fledgling is the way to put it. It's also the scale is. I'm not sure we can even grow enough for us to drink. Because we've got, I think there's about 10,000 acres under vine in the Okanagan, and that's it. That's it.
Okay.
And we share the land with like people and orchards. Certainly grapes are not the only crop from up there. So
To your point too, what you were saying about Canada being adventurous, I think I would agree with that to some extent, because I feel like a lot of, if you're talking to American somms and American consumers, it almost feels like the American consumer versus the Canadian consumers. The American consumer is a little bit more how can I say, they're almost a little bit more brand conscious. They're almost a little bit more like they want to play the greatest hits. And it's actually, I personally find, like, you talk to a lot of like American somms or American restaurateurs and stuff like that. They want the classics, and the classics of the classics of the classics. And that's what you'd serve at, these high-end restaurants in New York and Los Angeles and stuff like Chicago and stuff like that. They don't, there is a sect of the wine community in the United States that's very much, open to experimentation and natural wines and, all sorts of experimentation. But I feel like by and large, it's still very much iconoclastic in a sense. Like, it's very much, okay, well, if you're going to eat this, we're going to have this wine with this meal at this type of steak restaurant or this type of seafood restaurant, and that's the way it all kind of fits nicely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of those customers that go in there and just ask for the chef's special, what's the chef's dish, and just eat that because it's the recommended dish, and it's what they're famous for, right? Yeah. It's an interesting way of thinking, and we've often joked about as well going to America and looking at getting some vineyards or getting some fruit over there and doing essentially what we've been doing down here, because it's like they're still so much further behind, I guess, the experimentation side of what is happening down here in Australia. And I'm thinking, playing around with the idea that maybe it's a good opportunity to do that. So yeah, this is another option. But it's interesting. But yeah, as I said, I love the Canadian people. When I was there last year and had such a good time traveling around and visiting a few places. Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from somebody here. Patrice, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for joining us, Sam. It's wonderful to hear from you, and all the way from Australia. In regards to your selection of old world grapes, is it sort of like going backwards, or what was old was new again? Because my understanding from being in Australia some time ago, that a lot of the grapes that were grown at the beginning were like old world grapes, were the Italians or whatever, and then they realized that the Shiraz or the Cabs were doing better, so they yanked all those out and they replanted, with the new type of grapes, and now you're going back to that. Would that be an accurate sort of description of what's happened?
Yeah, it definitely would be. I mean, as I said before, the success of things like Grange and the Parker points really pushed Australians to rip out anything that was different and plant a lot of Shiraz and Cabernet. Whereas before we had things like Grenache and Touriga and those weird things because it used to be more of a fortified wine climate. But then with the rise of Shiraz and Cabernet, we had, and our biggest market didn't become the US anymore, it became China. And then they really wanted big, heavy reds because, again, they saw that they were getting lots of points from the critics. And so it was an easy way to make a quick buck and to make really, really good money. And it's been that way for a very long time now, but especially the interesting thing has been this year and even in the last couple of months, but China has announced an investigation into people essentially dumping wine into China from Australia. And it's really scared a lot of people because they're going to put a tariff on Australian wine going into China. China's really flexing their muscles at the moment towards us, especially on the return of this. So it could be a really interesting time to see what's going to happen out of this. Because I think Shiraz is, I wouldn't say it's not quite done, but it's certainly, we're seeing a turning point now, and people focusing more on the domestic market with everything that's happened this year. So it'll be an interesting change to see whether people keep on with the Shiraz trend or whether they do keep planting and experimenting with things that like what we're doing.
That's the second question, is that what is the old world wine sort of, how easy is it to get Italian wines in Australia, and what are the price points? Like, do Australians want to buy Australian Italian sort of style wines because it's a better value?
Yes and no. So the French stuff is really expensive. Well, everything's really expensive here now. So we have a 29% tax on the final price of a wine. So whatever the final price would be, add 29% onto it, and that, yeah, that's sort of the retail value of a wine. So anything that's imported is always has a high price point on it. It's really hard to find a wine for sort of under 30 Australian dollars. The $20 range. Yeah, between 20 and 30, there are some options, but it's predominantly all South Australian or Australian wines. And even then from the big producers who have economies of scale to be able to produce it. So yeah, imported stuff generally starts at $30 and above. So it's not particularly accessible to a lot of young drinkers, a lot of new drinkers, and just a lot of drinkers in general, which is probably one of the reasons why I've been predominantly a beer culture for such a long time as well. Down here. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, yeah, it's not that accessible, but the Italian styles are new and interesting. And because the world's becoming a smaller place, and Italy is sort of branching out and starting to export to us, we're seeing wines that we've never had here before. Everyone's pretty much had because we've had Shiraz and Cabernet and Pinot planted here for such a long time, everyone's had the French versions of those, but people's interests lie now in these new styles of wine that sort of ties in with this progressive nature of what's happening. And we're seeing it reflected in our wine industry too, in terms of production.
I'm just reading here. I've got a question from another audience member. Is the experimentation because of the range of climate there? Is the range of you mentioned multiple subclimates and things like that? Is that what allows you to try to do so many different things at once?
Yeah, definitely. Like in a day for me, I can drive from McLaren Vale. Like I'll start my day down here, which is the winery here. It's about 5 kilometers from the ocean. So we have we're very influenced by the ocean, and it's very shallow. It's not like places like Monterey or the Pacific West where it's they have that deep trench in there that the ocean has a cooling effect. The ocean here has a bit more of a warming effect, and so it's really quite warm, quite dry. And so we can start in that sort of place. I can drive 10 minutes or 15 minutes into Kaipo, and we're in the Adelaide Hills region, and where we get some of the Nebbiolo from. And I think, as we mentioned before, I don't think we could grow Nebbiolo down here in McLaren Vale because it would be cooked. It would be like growing Napa Nebbiolo. It just has so much sunshine. There's so much heat to it that it would just sort of fall over.
Fruit punch.
Any ripeness. And so yeah, we're able to grow things like that there. It's a great region for growing orange wine, like varieties for orange wine as well, which I'm really interested in. We get Riesling from up around that area as well. So you're instantly going from about 80 to 100 meters, roughly above sea level, to straight up to 400, 450 in a very short space of time. And so we have that. And as I said, it's only a 15-minute drive. And then if you follow the backbone of the Adelaide Hills, you go more inland, get a higher altitude, and you start getting more opportunities to do things like Pinot and Chardonnay and varieties that sort of grow a bit better there. So, and that's at an hour maximum to get out there. And so we do have a lot of these opportunities to grow a lot of different types of things. So I think that experimentation ties in both that personality and the opportunities to strive for something different and to do something different at the moment.
Sam, I have one question from one of our people on the call. If you could just quickly explain the name, the AlphaBox and Dice. I think you explained box and dice, but what's the totality of it?
Yeah, so alpha refers to the alphabet. So one of the things we're embarking on is to do the alphabet of wine. So I don't think I said it before, but all of our labels exhibit a letter of the alphabet in them. And every letter corresponds to a different style of winemaking. We then build a story. So the letter comes from building a story or a concept around what you're going to drink in a glass. So it's not necessarily, like, we don't call S isn't for Shiraz, essentially. In fact, our S is called the Siren because it's 100% Nero d'Avola. It grows down by the ocean in a little vineyard called, at a place called Maslin's Beach, which was actually Australia's first unclad beach or nudie beach. It's sort of famous for that. And so we get the grapes from down there, and the label is actually a naked siren surfing down by the ocean there. And that's done by a local artist who, I don't know if you guys remember the surf brand Mambo that came out many years ago. but he was an artist for basically a t-shirt brand like that. And it's a beautiful label that sort of ties in together with the concept of having this almost natural fresh wine that's grown, or grapes that are grown down by the ocean. And that was sort of our pitch to the artist. And so we take that concept, and then we give it to an individual artist or designer to come up with a really fun label for us. So we use both local and international artists. We have, one of our labels is done by an architect in Barcelona who does all of our artworks on architectural design programs. We've got another one called the Lazarus, is a local artist who does woodcuts. So that label was originally a woodcut. And so we like to experiment with that side of things. And the box and dice part, just to recover or to recap on that. So every letter is a different style of winemaking. I think I went through the spiel before, but it was we do white, red, pink, orange bubbles across French varieties, Italian, Spanish, German, Austrian, Portuguese, blends, single vineyard, single varietal, multi-vineyard. We do what's called the whole box and dice, which is an old Aussie expression that basically means the whole collection. Trying to use the letters of our alphabet to explore the different wine styles around the world, and using the South Australian vineyards.
Gotta ask, what's your favorite letter of the alphabet?
I like the S, obviously, being Sam. No. And I love Nero d'Avola. I think it's a really, really interesting wine. I love the Fog, is probably one of my favorite wines. I think it's a really interesting expression. And I love the label as well. I'll see if I can get a label. I'll try and get a few labels together.
Oh, I know the one on the right's the Alianico, right?
Yeah. So that's our Chola Alianico. I'll try and
The middle one's like Mick Jagger.
Yeah. So that. Let's move this back. So we've got a whole lot of different labels, lots of quite bright, quite colourful. And every label is a different expression. So like the Alianico label explores that idea of duality between, because Alianico quite has that really pretty delicate nose to it, violets and spices and sugar and spice and all things nice, things that girls are apparently made of, right? But then on the palate, it's just got those really grippy, aggressive tannin structure to it that makes it a really, really fun, interesting wine to drink. But you'd probably say it's more a little bit masculine on the palate as opposed to the feminine nose that you are expecting from the variety. This label is actually a bit of an homage to me and my time in Austria. It's a Grüner Veltliner, so 100% Grüner. But it's best described by the definition on the back. So we call it the so O with the two umlauts. And I'm sorry if anyone speaks Deutsch, but mein Deutsch is furchtbar, meaning it's terrible. But on the back, it's is the sound that you make attempting to speak Deutsch. And the second definition is your response when you become a Pez dispenser on the Austrian Alps. Which is a little anecdotal story that happened to me back in 2008 when I went skiing over there with my family. Stacked at skiing and my ski came off and cut my throat. So I don't know if you guys can see the scar on my throat. But, that's a little. I'll see if I can get into some light. Can you see the?
Yeah.
So that was caused by my own ski. Can you see that there?
Wow. That's crazy.
So a nice little anecdotal story to tie in with our Grüner Veltliner, our Austrian variety. We have some fun things like that. Mistress is our Iberian blend, John and Yoko on the front there. The Riesling is a bit more of that sort of classic South Australian style. So we like to play around with things and use different artists to give us a different story and a different appeal to our wines as well.
I gotta say, when I reminded everyone about the tasting tonight, the one thing I noticed you used to be on your website, but you don't have it anymore, is on the tasting notes for all the wines. You also had what sounds like, like so what it smells like, what it tastes like, and then someone at the winery is like what it sounds like. This sounds like, like Etta James if she were doing hip hop. This sounds like, like Stevie Wonder sped up at 133 RPM. Like, it's sort of like, I said, I don't know why they stopped doing it, because those are such, I love when people write tasting notes like that. I know a lot of people just frustrate them because it's like, well, I don't know what electric watermelon looks or sounds like or tastes like, but sometimes you get these really odd tasting notes and they're just perfectly encapsulate what you're trying to say, right? So
exactly. I feel like it's wine's all about the senses. You use every part of it, and so for me, it was always about creating the full story and the full picture on all of the wines, and for me, that includes the soundtrack that a wine evokes in you. There's that idea of is that synesthesia where you're tasting colors. I think there's a producer down in Tasmania who colors his labels based on top of that. And that, like, for me, like, that's what the Enigma label is all about, because it's all about, like, that's what the wine tastes like. It's, it's almost like a disco in your mouth sort of thing. And it's like licking the acidity of Barbera is like licking a 9-volt battery. So it sort of plays around with that. And that for me is about, it sort of expresses, that the wines are a holistic experience. You don't just use your one sense to taste it. Tannins don't exist as a taste. They're a feel, a touch sensitivity to it. So, and definitely sound can play a huge role in how you find or taste a wine. We did. I based, when I was at uni, I actually based one of my practicals around that. We had to form a tasting. And we had this tasting where we blasted music at people where they were trying to make tasting notes for it. And the result was they liked the wine less when there was a lot more, sensory input coming into them. So it was an interesting exercise. And certainly for us, like, it's like we don't curate the music in cellar door, but the experience of the cellar door sort of has to tie in with it, because you want people to walk away from our cellar door here feeling like they've become part of the brand, and they actually got a bit of an education, or feel like they walk away as part of the family, essentially.
Was there any duds? Was there any grape that you tried and you're like, oh hell no, like I've made an enormous mistake? Like what? I mean, you got so many different varieties. Some of them, they kind of all worked. I'm sure you didn't release the ones that didn't, but
I'll show you one of our wines, because it comes up with that story.
He's breaking out the blooper reel.
I don't want to recreate trauma.
So we have this wine called the Lazarus, right? So Lazarus for us, I mean, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the story of Lazarus, brought back from the dead. So this is our zombie wine. Basically, when things don't work, we came up with this idea of using the technique of ripasso to essentially recycle them. So, where traditional ripasso is passing young wines on Amarone skins to extract a bit of that last bit of sugar, but also get the bit more complexity into younger wines. So this is essentially the opposite. We take old wine that is, the experiments that haven't worked or has sat around in barrel for a long time. And I inherited a whole lot of barrels from the old winemaker that, let's just say they were past their prime. So what we did is we repassed them over pressed off. The first one was done on Montepulciano skins, where we we drained the tank and let it press out under its own weight for the better part of a day. And then we repassed this old wine, some of which was from Barbera from 2007, Tempranillo from 2010. Repassed it over the skins and let it sit there and steep like tea for a week. And what happened is the berries swelled up again. They absorbed with this old wine, but they did things like they got down the volatile acidity. They re-fermented a little bit. They got down the sulfur levels. They basically reinvented and reinvigorated this old wine that didn't work or didn't have a home anywhere else, and made a really, really beautiful, really, really interesting wine that still has a ghost of those old characteristics to it. Like, it's got that balance between younger characteristics, so like, you know, the sort of pickled cherries and violets and juicy fruits and herbaceousness, but underneath it's got that rum and raisin finish to it and a little more leather and spice behind it. It's a really interesting style of wine. So I guess in answer to your question, anything that doesn't work, we put aside. We've always got another use for it. Yeah. And there has been, most of the time it works out pretty well. And we have this sort of brand strength that we can, especially in the domestic market, where we can spin anything that doesn't sort of look particularly well or particularly right into something that does work for us. Or it's about not sort of letting anything go to waste, and making sure that we have the best opportunities and the best, I guess, the best wines at the end of the day that suit the purpose. But our wines are all vintage dependent as well. So like, we don't, like, from year to year, they'll change. They'll change completely in style. And that's just, I think, part of the story of wine. It's part of the beautiful thing about it, that wines tell a story of the time and place on which they were birthed, the growing season leading up to when they were picked, and then the winemaking conditions throughout vintage and then following maturation. And so I think they're really good at telling like a story of a sense of place. But like that 4-dimensional sense of place.
That's a much better ending to the story than I was anticipating. That's awesome. And it's awesome also that you have a following that will just kind of follow you on those experiments and follow you down those, down those streets where you don't know what's at the end. You know, it's very cool.
Yeah, again, we don't take ourselves too seriously. We're not one of those companies that is steeped in tradition, so we can just sort of be a little bit irreverent in the whole wine culture. And a lot of the wine, for me, you don't have to do a degree to understand wine. Like, people know what they want, people know what they enjoy, and you shouldn't be led by the nose to enjoy something you don't enjoy. And so it really helps to be able to communicate that and be honest with people. People know when you're trying to swindle them too. And so that's one of the big things. It's just be honest about it. And that I think creates a lot of brand loyalty as well, in what we do.
We've taken up way too much of your time. We're already, well, I promise you now, we're already well past an hour now. Does anybody have any? No, not at all. This has been really interesting. And I think it's really cool because, like I said, and we started off at the top, I mean, you're one of the brands, not only in Australia, but really in the world, that's really kind of ambitious like this and really doing different things. Sometimes you see other producers, we do our standard fare and we kind of throw an oddball out there because the winemaker is from Portugal or from Spain. So we thought we'd grow a couple rows of Tempranillo and see how that worked. But you guys really embraced it. And it's this spirit of wine that I think is really interesting. I applaud it. In our market, one of the biggest selling categories is the California Cabernet. And I think a lot of that, it becomes very cookie cutter, right? Oh, it's a Napa Cab. Okay, like it's a Robert Parker style cab. Okay, it's really big, it's really extracted, it's got a lot of oak, it's got a lot of alcohol. That's great. And it gets to a point where you almost become a monoculture of yourself, and you're sort of like, well, okay, it's another Napa Cab, another Napa Cab. I think it's to the point where it's like, why am I buying one over the other? Really, it's almost like picking a sports team and cheer for. Okay, I'll cheer for these guys, sure, and there you go, right? But no, I really applaud you guys' sense of creativity, your sense of adventure, and I think that I'll be honest. When I first discovered AlphaBox wines a few years ago, I was skeptical. I was like, I don't know, like trying to get people to buy Australian Sangiovese or Australian Aglianico. I don't know. I'll probably just stick another SKU of Penfolds in the rack and call it a day. But you know what? I'm glad I don't. It's actually, those big, like I said before, those bigger brands aren't the ones that are really driving Australia, especially in our market. So, kudos to you and the AlphaBox team, and keep up the good work.